Hello.
Hi,
Hi, how are you?
doing fine, but I got sick the
Oh,
previous week, so
yeah,
a little bit unproductive.
yeah. So, yeah, it's too bad. Did you have any updates or?
Not so much, but by this week, end of this week, I will have Morris Watermaid's Blender 3D model.
Okay.
So I will share the link or maybe a file
Yeah,
and our group.
that would be good. Yeah, thank you. All right. Yeah, that's great. How about you, Jesse? What's going on? I don't know if you're able to make it. Okay, yeah, hi. Looks like we're still waiting for Raj. I don't know if he's going to join us this week. I think he had exams this week, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't heard from him all week, so hopefully he's doing well. And I know this is the first week of coding week, so hopefully people are getting into their projects. So hello, it's okay. So did you have an update for us? First week of coding period.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so actually, this is according to my uh, timeline. I had to make set up the Django. Actually, I have my exams till Monday. But before the next meeting, I will wrap this up and part of this work as well before the next week's meeting.
All right. So it looks like you're
So
setting everything up.
yeah, most of my time went into the exam preparations itself. But before the next meeting, I'll complete all the work and update.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah.
Just a reminder, questions are welcome and updates and Slackman. And you can ask questions about the coding, but also any other questions about like presenting or communicating too. I think it's important to reiterate that there's sort of the direct learning of how do I code this, but there's a lot of the indirect learning will be communications and expectations and learning how to make presentations and stuff like that. So if you're unsure about anything, you can put it there. I did a little bit of reviewing some things this week and made a few comments on this and that, but it's mostly it's not always about the direct content. So just a reminder of that, but nothing major for me. It's been a really lot going on my end over this past week, but I'm looking forward to things stabilizing a bit of my end, but also just seeing where we go. And now that the summer's starting to begin, I think there'll be a lot of interesting things coming up. But we're here to help you, whatever form that takes. So that's my brief update for today.
Yeah. Yeah, Jesse, it sounds great. And we'll have to do some distinction between some of these indirect and direct learning pathways because I think that's good for the entire group. I mean, we talk about like demo or die and other types of things, but we don't really get into what that means and how to do it. So that'd be good to get that worked out.
Yeah, there will be more. I think that I'm in conjunction with some other stuff that I'm kind of building out. I don't want to. I'm very not cautious, but I don't want to. I want to kind of match the flow of what the project development is, Like I don't really want to. I'm a little bit hesitant to say, okay, here's a curriculum of like other skills I want you to learn during this coding period. But that's not about. But I feel like maybe small segments that add on to things, or that like are weighted less, like at the end of the meeting or something. Because I don't want to like there will be meetings where we'll have a lot of like coding questions to talk about, or some requirement for okay, how do we report this to Google, But also, if there's time, there's sort of that other side of things that is available. So I've kind of been not wanting to like drop it on people, but there's stuff there to do. So I think having a little more structure that should be good too. But I also want to kind of see. I think there's a reason why like mentors or people in the situation may kind of wait to see what people want to do first.
Right.
And I kind of did that. Like I did that with one of a presentation. I'm like, well, I don't want to actually offer any corrections at the outstart, because sometimes you have to go through the process fully, and then afterwards it can be okay. Here's some things to point out. So it's kind of like that, but yeah, there's a lot more. I could ramble on about that the whole rest of the hour, but we don't need to do that today. So
No.
that's probably good for now.
But yeah, I did. I've done in the past where I've drawn out these pathways. So like you draw a diagram to show the steps to doing something, and it's available to contributors. So if we have like a direct learning pathway, say like this is what you need to. This is how you facilitate this. And it's useful not only for contributors, but also for people leading projects. Because, like Amanda's starting her projects and she's going through the motions, trying to know like what works and what doesn't. We have a set of tools right there, it makes it easier to do that. So other people can lead projects as well, or, kind of get those things going. And so.
As a very brief side note, right? This isn't really relevant to Google Summer of Code directly, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that I made a frontier map submission for Robot, and also for the hybrid digital designs, so you might recall that.
Right.
And I think there's going to be this sort of building pedagogical structures into different things that's on my mind a lot. So that's partly why I'm phrasing it this way. So more about that in other spaces. But yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I wanted to mention that thank you, Vrushali, for your presentation last week on your project. It was very good. And then Raj, I don't know if you want to do a presentation on your proposal if you have time. It's just like a 15-minute presentation on basically the outline of the proposal. It doesn't need to be that overwhelming or over the top. You think you want to do that in the next few weeks, or?
Yeah, sure. I'll let you know once I'm ready for it.
Yeah, it'd be good. And you can do it like either on a Friday or in the Saturday meeting. It doesn't really matter. But I wanted to have like the proposal presentation, and then at the end we do what you've learned. So.
Yeah, it's a good way to see kind of the what you were thinking at the start and how it will change over time. And I think that's kind of, especially for, it's actually really related to research in general, but this is sort of coding and then like making a project and aiming at something, which is slightly different, but it's so much of the fruit of doing this stuff is, understanding the change and understanding the roads you took and the roads you didn't take. So it's a good way to do that.
Yeah.
It's been good that folks have been writing their blogs and their other updates too. So all of those things kind of lead to that, and excuse me. When you can, the presentation will be an important part of that.
Yeah. And yeah, so thank you also for keeping your blog updates updated. Like I said, and now that we're turning towards the coding period, you can do that on a weekly basis, roughly. But it's going to be more like maybe experiential, maybe some talk discussion of code. But it's like just basically to have that process, working through problems. So some of it will be experiential, like saying I did this week, and it was hard or easy, and then like maybe some discussion of the code, the problem, and the coding problem at hand or whatever. I mean, it doesn't need to be like a lot of work. It's just something where you're keeping mental notes and you're putting them down, and we have those things there. And then at the end of the project or for subsequent years, we can go back to that and look and see what the process was for doing this. So I think that's always quite useful just in the moment, because you're kind of recapping your week, and we can go through that in the meeting even just to see what the thought process was there. So, and sometimes you get into a project and you work on it and you're really in that mind space, and then 6 months later you come back to it and you have no idea what you were doing, and it's like kind of the details. You have files, you have the code in front of you, but you don't remember why you did something. And so that's always a problem with projects, especially when you pick up something and you put it down and you come back to it later, or someone else tries to do it, is that you don't know what that headspace was. You can't remember. And so preserving that is very hard. And one of the ways to do it, I think, is through that sort of, note taking, documentation, but also that kind of note taking where you're putting out your experience, and you're maybe putting out problems that you didn't really necessarily solve during that week, but you may want to do in the future, and posing it like as, okay, this is something that we could have done, or this is something I maybe want to do later, and just having it there.
I think that's a really important differentiation, because as part of, I think it's a requirement for Go Summer Code outright that you provide some form of documentation at the end of this, which also, by the way, don't wait till the end to start your documentation necessarily. But documentation for like how some things work technically can be very different from the headspace or the ideas that were really important to you as you were trying to explore the material. And that's almost like making art in a way. Like you have to sort of make these. So in frontier map terminology, I'm developed my own language for this stuff, and I'm using things like landmark or reference points. And you kind of have to make, in the process of what we're talking about, like how do I capture my headspace as I'm doing stuff, you just have to make these things. We just designate something as a landmark, and then kind of talk about it, and do like make an entry or writing or something that captures this, something that can anchor your headspace to an extent. And I feel like that's actually something that's hard to talk about, but also really important. It's one of those like, should this really be as esoteric as it is kind of things. It's it's not really a soft. I guess maybe a soft skill, like an internal soft skill. It's part of writing. It's something that maybe mention some people that do a lot of creative projects do stuff like this. It's not like a hidden thing, but it's sort of expected. And then the good thing about experience is like a very indirect or somewhat implicit learning of this whole experience will be that there will be things you'll forget to write down or talk about or whatever, and it's like, oh, I gotta remember how to do that next time. I actually think if I was doing this, frankly, I think what I would do outside of like outside of things you show us, I'm in my not quite infinite knowledge and experience, I would basically sit down at the end of every week and record myself talking to myself about what I was thinking about all week. Like, give me 5 minutes, but it's just for yourself to have in whatever language you want, and in your current headspace, make a video of it. And I'm not saying anyone has to do this. You don't have to send us any videos, but like for myself, and it's a nice thing to do for this project, but especially like for bigger, like for really serious things, or when you're doing a really involved, complicated work that's that you'll do in the future, that's even less structured and more harder, and the deadlines and the risks are higher. I think it's a great thing to do. Like, I use a lot of voice recording. Like, I use like Otter AI. I use different things to just capture my notes, or like to transcribe my speech into some text, and just record it. Because that's, as Bradley and I have kind of created a bit of a language about this. Like, we talk about twirly birds, which I don't know if I'll be able to explain them to people who don't know them, but they're like the things that fall down from the trees and spiral a bit in the air before they hit the ground. And it's like the seedlings basically that are in some trees or whatever. And I don't know if I'll look quickly for a GIF here just to see what that.
I think it's North America specific. It's like a
right,
maple tree seed.
Falling. It's kind of there's this a loose analogy of like falling leaves in general. I'm just gonna share this wonderful autumnal picture, but there's sort of like something falling from the sky, and it lingers in the air a bit, and then it falls down. And we'll call that, we'll kind of refer to those things as, you have these ideas, and they'll pass quickly. You might hear people say, "Oh, always write, have a notebook with you," or like you might think of something when you're going to sleep or wake up at night with an idea. It's kind of all related to that, but having some slightly formal way of capturing those thoughts that pass is really useful, because it's hard to do, and also can be very important. And especially, the critical thing is that when you're in the moment, you have all of this sort of like short-term zeitgeist. You have this, you're in the zone, like you're thinking about the stuff every day, every week. You have other people asking you about it. Well, there's this context that it's easy to think about it and recall it. It's not in the past, it's in the present. But eventually it will be in the past, and if you need to reference it, that's the hard thing. It's like, what are these sort of breadcrumbs or landmarks or things you can do to come back to later? And that, it kind of almost seems like a waste of time in the moment, but as you build upon things, especially complicated things, it actually becomes very invaluable. So, again, take away from this, you don't have to show us any voice recordings, you don't need any videos, we're not asking for anything like that at all. But it's a nod as in terms of like actually mentoring you and things to think about as you're doing this. It's sort of like what do you do with that? How are you capturing the things that aren't just documenting or code? How are you collecting your ideas? How are you managing all this stuff? How are you relating? How are you making it easier for your future self to look back on things now? And it can be, I understand if it's a bit frustrating to say this, like, oh, well, I'm not doing it yet. I haven't made a bunch of code, I haven't done it yet. And that's fine. This is more things to have in the back of your mind as you're making stuff, ongoing and into the future.
Yeah, it's like assistive. It's like an assistive method for keeping things like, all the things that come out of research or working on code. So you're working on a problem and you have these ideas or things that you want to reference, come back to. So it's like having a way to do that and reference it. I say this as someone who's not perfected this, or anyone who gives you advice is probably not perfected it. So, it's and a lot of people have a very informal work style, so they just like to code and get it over with. But it does help. We do things like annotate code, and there are ways to do. There are always like landmarks and things like that in virtual worlds where you have references to points in space, and there are different types of even in our two-dimensional interfaces we have things like that where there are different pointers for to remind people where something is. So it's very, very useful, I think. So yeah, thank you, Jesse, for that. And I look forward to looking at your Frontier Maps preprint when it's done, or the slides for the presentation that you plan to do at We Robot.
The hybrid digital design one, I really want to try to get something as close to a functional preprint in the next 2 weeks for that. We Robot should be definitely by then. I appreciate that. That's very far away. I'm a little bit nervous about that one. For some, I think so they changed their website about something, but I'm like, are they going to be like reducing poster stuff? There wasn't that many submissions, but still, you never know. So I don't know. I'll try to go there either way, but yeah, it's interesting. But thanks. I'll get that later.
Yeah. So I look forward to all that. So I wanted to talk. Let's see. We have something in the chat. Oh, this is your meme here. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I have some more things on VR. I've been not talking about the open source sustainability as much in the meetings, but I will turn to that when it's appropriate. Actually, a note on that, Thursday, very early for my time in the morning, I presented a presentation, Open Source Sustainability, to the Sustainable AI Workshop in Germany. So that was on, yeah. This was Jesse.
Thank you so much, Burley, for doing that.
You're welcome, yeah. So it was from last summer's GSoC, myself, Jesse, and then Brian, Hussein, and Himanshu, who worked on the models. And so just kind of went over the models and, the future directions. And it kind of framed it in this sort of cybernetic aspect. We tried to do that last summer and didn't really, we kind of came up short on the cybernetic aspect because, we were focused on the code, but also because it's very hard to map some of these concepts to what is out there in the literature. So there's this model called the ethical regulator, which is where you're trying to regulate ethical behavior. And so a lot of our models for the open source sustainability project involve, reinforcing virtuous behaviors. And so going through that material and doing the presentation, I noticed that was the theme that we have. We're trying to get people to do things that lead them to not only participate in open source communities and stay there or have a stickiness to it, but also to do good work. And this is part of that good work, is having these methods working and making sure that you're able to work effectively and efficiently. But also this sort of the different things that came up in the model. So in the personality research that Hussein did, there's this aspect of finding compatible types to work together. So, if we have a similar personality versus an antagonistic personality, we're more likely to work together and be successful. Or if your community is filled with people who are always antagonistic towards one another, then you're not likely to succeed. So those are things you can model with agent-based models, and get some sort of clarity on how you need to design your community. So that's really what the talk was about. But also going through like the active inference and reinforcement learning models. I noticed there was this theme of like feedback and this role of the feedback loop. So we talk about what do we need to do to have a sustainable community. And there are a lot of examples of just measuring things like GitHub repositories. So you can measure how many commits someone's made to a GitHub repository. And that tells you if people are successful. But the problem is, of course, it allow for, sustaining that. It's like people might contribute a lot to a GitHub repository for a little while, maybe 2 months, and then they drop off. You have to interpret what that drop off is. It could be that they're working on a version of the software and they stop doing that, and then maybe they'll come back to it later. Or maybe they just run into an insurmountable problem and people give up. Or it could just be that people don't have the time to do things. And so there's that aspect of feedback. What is the feedback? What are the set of feedback mechanisms that you need to have to sustain things? And sometimes the answer is going to be different for different things. So for the reinforcement learning models, we have all these policies that we can choose from. What do the policies need to look like that are really, if you think about taking what we learned from reinforcement learning and using it as like a design principle, what are the policies that you would need to implement in the real world? So what I mean by policy is sort of in the reinforcement learning context, but not not in the same way. So it's like a formal policy or a community standard. So, for example, if I find that if I have a community of a certain composition, and I find that we're able to sort of, turn things into gold, which means that you're very successful at keeping your community sustainable. There's a certain policy there. You might find it using reinforcement learning, but then you want to turn that into a set of rules for your community. You might be able to say, well, we'll have these policies where people only can work, on a project for so long, and then they have to move to a different project, which you'd think would be disruptive, but it might actually prevent burnout. And so it's actually quite useful. Or we want to recruit a lot of people, but we also want to incentivize them to continue on with their work. One of the problems you have in a lot of communities is there's a lot of turnover. People come in really excited. They don't see a lot going on. They don't know where to fit in. They drop out, and that's it. And so that's a problem that is maybe solvable through these policies, maybe not. And then the active inference is, where you're trying to infer sort of the beliefs or the cognitive states of your other contributors in the community. So basically coordinating your efforts, coordinating your beliefs about things, and coordinating how to do things. So that, again, you could use like community standards, but the problem with community standards is that they're standards, that they're not flexible necessarily. So sometimes people prefer to use different technologies. Sometimes people prefer, say, to use, one type of platform versus another. There's a tendency to standardize platforms and standardize tools, but sometimes it doesn't work for some people for some reason. I know with the project management stuff that Jesse does, we've been through a lot of different platforms where we go through from like Notion to, or where did we start? Like we were experimenting with Obsidian at one time, and then we moved to Notion, and then Notion has benefits but also drawbacks. So we use other things to backfill, to make up for what Notion doesn't have, and so it's a real struggle, to keep that tool, that the what they call a technology stack, current and useful to people. And sometimes, even though there's this tendency to standardize things, and in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that standardization is useful to keeping people working on the project and being successful, sometimes you have to offer flexibility. Sometimes people just need to be able to use the tools that they can work with well, and that's that. And so, I don't want to impose coding tools on researchers and research tools on coders, and because they have different needs. And so that's one of the challenges that we have. And so, when like Raja's been looking through the models, thinking about how to improve the project, one of the things about the models that we have is that they have certain they assume certain things. They sort of give you this sort of scenario for improvement, and then you have to kind of fill in the blanks. And that's kind of where we're fuzzy on this. We maybe can use like things like GitHub commits and things to characterize what people were doing, but sometimes we just need to like take a guess at like what our community's doing. And what we're trying to do is just develop these simulations that kind of fill in the gaps, at least in terms of like how to, what are the principles maybe that arise from some of these patterns of use, but also, kind of building scenarios. So saying, we don't really know what's going on in our community. We don't really know how to measure it very well. But if we build these scenarios based on sort of our intuitions, we can, build these models and say, okay, I think that the community looks like this, but let's say it doesn't. Let's say it looks like this. So you can test different models of what we think is going on in the community and see what that looks like. And then maybe it looks exactly like what you see in your community. Maybe you can do planning and say, I want my community to look like this, and kind of think of different, milestones that you might achieve to get to that point. So it allows you, it's very flexible in that regard, but, we're very fuzzy on how we implement that. So we have to give that more thought. It's not an easy thing to address. And maybe it's not something we can do this summer, but we can kind of work towards it. So, there is that interface, the auditing tool, the models, but also we need to think about how to, how people are going to use it. Why would they use it, and how would they use it effectively versus not effectively, which is just plugging in data and getting a pretty picture and saying, okay, that's great. And then, that sort of thing leads to not having an active user base. So actually, I did present on this, and it is on our YouTube channel. Okay, so this is the Society Ethics and Tech playlist. We have 2 videos on it right now. This open source sustainability video, which is 20 minutes, and then Jesse gave an update on the Society Ethics and Tech state of the program, which was 30 minutes. And we want to add to these playlists as we go along. So this is an example of how we can use our activities in one initiative and go to, build on other initiatives. So, this is the society. Yeah, let me do that. I'll just make a copy here. There you go. And the presentation is sort of a condensed version of what Oops. It's kind of a condensed version of what we want to do. There are a lot of a lot of strings to pull there. So if you have ideas after watching the talk, please bring it up. It may not be something we can immediately address, but it's something that we need to keep in mind. So I wanted to talk also about a couple other things. So we were talking about pull requests, and Vrushali said that she wanted to have some tutorials on that. And there are a lot of tutorials online. I don't know. I think she's looked at those tutorials and said, they're probably useful, I imagine. It's a pretty basic thing where you go through and you say, this is the mechanics of a pull request. In the project management course I teach, I kind of do that as a first exercise, or the first homework is like making a pull request. And, you have to do something like add your name to a list. And so, but you have to know how to do a pull request to do that. So it's a couple of steps long, and it's pretty easy once you learn it. But the bigger question is, why would you make a pull request, or what is it? Okay, what is a pull request? And so it's just a way to take your contribution to a repository and include that into the repository. But it's also a way for people to review that. So if I'm the owner or the maintainer of a repository, I want to look at that repository and say, I want people to come and contribute. I want them to add in their code or add in their perspective on something. If they want to improve a file and they think they have a solution, I want to be able to get their contribution into the code base quickly. But I also want to be able to review it to make sure it's okay, make sure it's up to our standards, or maybe they're just trying to put in some malicious code. There are all sorts of possibilities there. And so the pull request is really a way to safeguard the repository. But it's also a way to keep quality, quality assurance standards, to be able to communicate with someone, and to have to manage the access. So those final 2 points, you want to have a conversation with people when you make a pull request, if needed. Sometimes, as we know, this is a very collaborative effort. So if I say I find a file, for example, and I say I want to make changes to this file, I think that there are some changes that need to be made to make it run better. I might tell you that, okay, that's great, but I want you to make a separate version of that, because we want to keep the old code for, we want to either have it as like a template, or maybe, you're adding functionality for a different platform, and we want to keep the old functionality intact, but we want to also have this new contribution. So to do that, you would issue a pull request. I can review the code, and I say the code is great, but I want you to add this as a separate file. And so I would say that, I would comment the thing, and then you would go back and make that change, and then I would accept it, and we'd be done. You can have longer transactions or conversations about, maybe what needs to be done. So you propose maybe a single change, and you say, I think this is great, but I want to do more work and I don't know how to do it. So you can, through GitHub, use the pull request system to go back and forth and make iterative changes. That's a little bit more intense. And in fact, some of those conversations might be better in a discussion forum. So that's something, though, that people do often in pull requests. And there are a lot of times when you want to make comments to people, you want to get their attention, and you can do this. And sometimes pull requests are very long in terms of the number of comments. You also want to, if possible, bring in the issue number. So you want to link the issue into the pull request and say, this is the issue I'm addressing. So it just makes it easy for the maintainer to know what you're doing. In the summer code, like I said, I want to review our code contributions on a regular basis. I also encourage you to make pull requests to the repos that I showed you last week, And then, we can maybe have a conversation about some of these contributions, either through the GitHub interface or through the meetings. But there's also something else that we want to be concerned with. And that is this idea of when to do a pull request. So it's not always immediate when a pull request needs to be done. Like I said, if you make a change to a file, that's an obvious time when you want to make a pull request. But you want to use them strategically. You don't want to just make a pull request for anything. So I might make one change to a file. I don't want to make a pull request every time I make a change to a file, because I might say, for example, fork a repository, have my own version of it, make like 150 changes to the code, and then push it back in one single pull request. That is kind of hard to review, but it's also better than making a pull request every time I make some small change and overwhelming the maintainer. So you have two scenarios. You have the one where they're making this massive pull request that will take 2 hours to review and may confuse the maintainer, or you have where every change you make is being pushed and requires an approval. So those two scenarios we want to avoid. We want to go in between in some way. So this article is from How to Geek. I'll post this in the Slack channel, Google Summer Code Slack channel after the meeting. But this kind of goes through how to make, not just how to make a pull request, but how do you use them. And so this is something that you see in GitHub, of course, but any Git system is a pull requestable. So there are other Git systems like Atlassian, like Bitbucket, Atlassian's Bitbucket, and there are other, even I think maybe Subversion allows you to do pull requests. I'm not sure, but any kind of version control system, a Git system, will have pull requests. There are other version control systems like Open Source Framework that I don't think they have pull requests because the mode of collaboration is different. So a pull request basically allows you to have this decentralized system where I can make a fork of your repository, basically copying it to my account, making the changes in my account separate from the main repository, and then pushing them back so that they can be reviewed and approved and incorporated into the main trunk. Now, you may not always want to push things that you change. Sometimes you want to build a separate version on your own and you don't want to push back to the trunk. So that's fine. But sometimes you do, and this is why you make pull requests. So when you want to push changes, which is what we do when we pull, pull request is where you're pulling from one repository and you're pushing to another repository. So you're trying, the terminology is a bit, it takes some getting used to. But so you're basically pushing changes. You make a commit and run git push, which is in the command line version. In the interface that you use for GitHub, there's a button for make a pull request. It sends your updates to a given remote, which is usually a trunk of a repository, which is the main repository. And then it updates the remote repository to be in sync with your repository. So it basically synchronizes things. And so let's see. So technically you can do a pull and a push, and there are different variations on this. So I'm not going to get into those variations. I try to keep it simple for purposes of this. But this is really, a backbone of open source libraries. So, we want to have the ability for anyone to contribute, to have these things decentralized. So I can take your code, make a copy for myself, use the copy any way I want, modify it, use it as is. But if I want to make a change to it and incorporate it into the main software, I can do that too. So it really just gives you this flexibility. So these open source libraries, to develop these in this way, pull requests are what make these work. So pull requests are sort of like the core of a lot of this open source collaboration. The maintainers and administrators are the ones who approve everything. They're the ones who get all the pull requests and they have to approve. And then they review them, of course, as well. They give comments. They have to make decisions that are consistent with the community standards. And so sometimes you're asked to make formatting changes because the community has certain requirements for things. And that's where you get a lot of things where, you make a pull request and it gets sent back to you, not merged, and they ask you to make changes. And then when it's approved, then it'll be merged into the main repository and you can see your work there in the trunk. Pull requests aren't exactly a feature of Git itself, so the exact implementation of them will vary depending on the service. So, if you go to GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, there are different ways that it gets done. It's not an inherent feature, but it's a core method for doing this. And so this shows you kind of different aspects of pull requests. And really, you want to tie this to some issue. So if there's an issue that you're solving for, you want to have, of course, there are going to be files that you change. And in the pull request, you'll see different files that have been changed. And the maintainer can go review those files. It'll show the differences in the files, so it shows what's been added. But you really want to link it to an issue. And if there isn't an issue that's been made for it, you want to make an issue that can correspond to the pull request you're making. The issue usually is something that you file in, like we'll just say GitHub. It has a number, and it's basically a ticket that you can describe the thing that's needed, the reason why it's needed, and then you can use the pull request to say, okay, we addressed this issue, we made these changes. This is how this issue is going to be implemented in code and in practice. And so, this allows you to discuss things. It gives you a common reference frame and so forth. So like I said, pull requests are different from issues, but they can be used in tandem. And this is really how you want to do pull requests. You want to do them so that they're about the right size for people to review. You don't want to give them 1,000 files unless they're just kind of trivial changes, but you also don't want to make a pull request for every small change you make. You also want to link it to an issue that has a description of what the need is. So if I'm reviewing a change, I don't think it's just trivial or, whatever. I mean, some communities have different standards. So sometimes any contribution is welcome. And if it's a small change like typos or something even, that's fine. That can be approved. But sometimes it's a feature that you're adding. And so you need to describe what the feature is. You need to say why it's important. People may not want to add features in. If you think about a project lifecycle is where you have a series of features that are added or removed from the program. And so if you add in a feature that they're not planning to support in the future, or if you're adding in a feature that conflicts with other features, that's a problem. And they can't really put it into the code base if they're not sure that it'll work well. So there's this larger issue of planning that needs to be thought about. You push some piece of code, you as the contributor don't necessarily know what the roadmap is. I mean, some organizations publish the roadmap, but there's a lot of decision making that goes on under the hood that you can't necessarily account for. And so this kind of goes over making pull requests. And so I'm going to post this in the channel for review later. If you'll find that interesting, I think, especially doing pull requests. I don't plan to be too contentious about that, but then there's this other article from GitHub Docs, and I'll post this in the chat as well. This is about collaborative development models. So this is the last point that I mentioned. This is sort of the detail on that. So depending on your development model, how you envision your project, workflow and your roadmap, that's going to depend on how people use pull requests. So the way you use pull requests depends on the type of development model you use in your project. you can use the fork and pull model or the shared repository model. And so I think this reflects like there are these two methods of building a project. You can either do like what they call a branch model or a trunk model. So basically, the branch model is where everyone shares a repository and they create branches and they merge those branches in. Or you can also take main repository, fork off repositories to say your own account, and then push back to the main repository. And the benefit, I guess, of a shared repository model is that you're making these branches that are easily accessible in the main organization. Whereas the fork model, you have forks all over the internet, all over GitHub, which aren't easily accessible necessarily, and you have to kind of go. I think the branch development model is good for orgs that are integrated. Usually, like if there's a lot of internal development that's going on in GitHub, and you're making like different versions, like for development or for release, you can make different branches based on that, and then you can easily push between different branches. So there's less contention, there's less like free development. It's just kind of like we're developing different versions of the software. We're either going to do like a development version where we're testing out features, or we'll have like a production branch where we're actually pushing something to a final version. And so you can keep things straight that way. So they talk about the fork and pull model. So in the fork and pull model, anyone can fork an existing repository and push changes to their personal fork. You do not need permission to the source repository to push a user-owned fork. The changes can be pulled into the source repository by the project maintainer. When you open a pull request proposing changes to your user-owned fork to a branch in the source, which is upstream, you will allow anyone with push access to the upstream repository to make changes to your pull request. So this is popular amongst open source projects where you have a lot of people from all over the world coming in and contributing things. Really, the issue here too is permissions. So I'm going to give both of you permissions, and I forgot to do that, but I will, to our organization, GitHub, which means that you'll have access to the organization. I still expect you to make pull requests, but technically you can accept your own pull request. It'll be weird, but that'll be the way we'll do it. And so that's something that, there are permissions you can give people as well. It kind of keeps people from just making any change they want. So, if there's something that you want to kind of keep amongst a certain number, certain core of developers, and then maybe accept contributions from other places, you can control that through permissions. And so that's fork and pull. Then the shared repository model is where collaborators are granted push access to a single shared repository, and topic branches are created when changes need to be made. So these topic branches are like what I talked about, like the production branch and the development branch and the beta testing branch, just having places where you can have different kind of like modes of the software, and then you can kind of where that fits in, and you'll be your changes will reflect sort of the mode of the release. So it's like if you're doing development, you can make a change to test things out, but you don't want to push to say like a production branch something that's highly experimental, because the production branch is going to be for things that are pretty much figured out, and it's small changes that are going to be useful there. So pull requests are useful in the shared repository model as they initiate code review and general discussion about a set of changes before the changes are merged into the main development branch. So this is prevalent with small teams and organizations collaborating on private projects. So if we're doing like our open source sustainability or VR for research, those are kind of, private projects for now. We're a small team, so, but we don't have to use any one model. We could use a shared repository, We could use any other type of model we want, but this gives you an idea of how people use these in the open source world. And so I'll post this in the chat as well, or in the Slack as well, so you have a reference for when you're doing these things. And I think, going forward, if you're going to contribute to open source, that'll be very useful. So any comments or questions before we go?
No, it'd be good to get into GitHub more. There'll be more about that ahead for sure.
Okay, so thank you for meeting. And next week, let's plan on giving updates, and hopefully we get start getting some things done, or like we want to be able to hit our milestones. But if we don't, we want to be able to know where we need to allocate resources. So every week we'll be going through and saying, these are the things these are the milestones I met. Maybe these are the ones I didn't meet, and why that you didn't meet them, and then how do I keep on track? Because we have a short schedule this summer. It's not that many weeks, and we want to make sure that we keep some semblance of being on track. Now we don't have, we can rethink some parts of the schedule if we need to. Like I said initially, that's always a thing that people are doing, because you run into issues with technology, and sometimes things don't work out so well. But we'll just get those things addressed as we meet them. So okay, thank you. Talk to you later.
Take care.
Take care.